This is Spirituality Without the Supernatural, a childhood based on evidence. I'm Ezra Neeson. This semester at the Secular Freethought Society, we've talked a lot about how powerful feelings fit into atheism. Spirituality, as I use the word, means intuitive feelings that work out pretty well for a person as far as they can tell. A lot of atheists grew up in religious households. Then somewhere along the way, you realize that the ideas you've been raised on just don't fit together in a way that makes sense. I didn't grow up in a religious household. And more than that, my parents actively figured out how to use all the helpful stuff of religions without the superstitions. My dad is really good at putting science ideas into words and drawing logical conclusions from them. My mom is his peer review board because she's really intuitive and keeps asking questions until my dad's science ideas feel like they fit together. They had three basic principles. 1, believe in facts. 2, try to figure out how much other people's points of view are based on facts. And 3, try to figure out how facts make people misinterpret facts. At our meeting 2 weeks ago, we had a debate with some Christians about the foundation of morality. And a lot of what was said in that debate were the same kinds of things that always get said in those kinds of debates. A lot of religious people think atheism turns science into a religion and think that their own religion is better. People like that just don't have any starting point for understanding what atheism is. Atheism isn't a belief system the way a religion is. Atheism is a system of expectations that anything anyone wants people to treat as a fact be observable, self-consistent, universal, reproducible, and debatable. So from that we can say that the foundation of atheist spirituality is strong feelings about ideas that have been proved or disproved scientifically, curiosity and open-mindedness about ideas that haven't been proved either way, and a willingness to change your feelings by any amount necessary as new discoveries are made. If you have strong feelings about facts, you have a lot of strong feelings that fit together well. A lot of people don't think of those feelings as spirituality because there's no mystery to why those kinds of feelings work together so well. A lot of people who call themselves spiritual don't realize how much science depends on spirituality. Scientific discoveries are made by people who notice things that nobody else has noticed yet. Before scientists can conduct experiments to prove that patterns exist, they have to look at some body of evidence and feel that there's a pattern to it that nobody has discovered yet, but that they can discover if they look for certain clues. Likewise, a director of a high-budget movie starts the process with a belief that over the next year he will be able to bring together literally millions of artistic decisions that individually are abstract into something that a lot of people will relate to well. Even if you just make big life decisions based on your feelings about unquantifiable factors, that's spirituality too. It seems to me that the confusion about spirituality hinges on our perceptions of how much effort the other people are investing and how close to the truth they're getting because of it. Continuing to believe in religious traditions from thousands of years ago takes effort. Switching from one belief system to another also takes effort. Believing in evidence that disproves things you originally feel to be true takes effort also. The amount of effort that each of these things takes are affected by our personalities and how we learn about them. If you can see that someone's efforts are leading them toward what you believe to be the truth, you respect them for it. If you think the other person's efforts are leading them further and further from the truth, that doesn't look like spirituality. That just looks like someone making a big mistake. A religion is a set of ideas and an assumption that people will have similar feelings about those ideas. That set of ideas is put into words. That gives each religion a vocabulary for talking about its ideas. That makes the ideas easier to talk about among people who share those feelings, but it makes it harder to talk about ideas with people who don't share the feelings. In the debate with the Christians, I heard people say that we have morals because the Word of God is written in the hearts of everyone, and we all have the choice whether to accept it or not. Christians who have a lot of similar personalities, life experiences, and cultural values can say that to each other and understand what they're talking about because all of those words fit into a context that makes them mean something. To atheists, that sentence contains so many abstractions, it doesn't mean anything. except that the person has strong feelings about something. To a lot of religious people who say things like that, the meaning of that sentence seems so obvious that people who can't understand it must be willfully ignoring it or extremely dim-witted. Either way, you seem to those people to be seriously failing at life. Ex-religious atheists know which ideas of their former religions didn't make sense to them. So when you debate with religious people and you hear them use the same arguments, you pounce on them and try to get the other person to see what you saw. Then those debates usually bog down on small points and we never get to look at a bigger picture. From the outside looking in, every religion is a set of ideas that inspire people. Those ideas motivate people individually. That motivation of individuals creates communities because people who can see that other people share the same motivations and their sources of inspiration feel they can depend on each other to make compatible decisions. As atheists, where can we look for ideas that are inspiring to us and that we know are also inspiring to other people? First, there are books and stories. If you believe in a religion that's based on a book, you believe that your book about the meaning of life is the most interesting book ever. The King James Version of the most interesting book ever begins like this. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, etc., etc. When I was learning to read, the most interesting book I knew of started like this. I am Sam. Sam I am. That's Sam I am. That's Sam I am. I do not like that Sam I am. Do you like green eggs and ham? I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. Etc., etc. What made Green Eggs and Ham so interesting to me was that it was a story about two characters with conflicting points of view. One was the old serious guy, and the other was the young comical guy with the new ideas. My parents always read that book using a different tone of voice for each character. To me, that made it much more of a story about something happening than a story about the universe being created told in only one tone of voice. On one level, Green Eggs and Ham is a story about why you should try new foods before you decide whether you like them or not. On a higher level, it's a story about why you shouldn't decide whether something is true or not without evidence. As Dr. Seuss said, children's reading and children's thinking are the rock-bottom base upon which this country will rise, or not rise. In these days of tension and confusion, writers are beginning to realize that books for children have a greater potential for good or evil than any other form of literature on earth. And also, I think I can communicate with kids because I don't try to communicate with kids. 90% of the children's books patronize the child and say, "There's a difference between you and me, so you listen to this story." I, for some reason or another, don't do that. I treat the child as an equal. There's another part to the effectiveness of religious creation myths. They're simple explanations that are easy to tell children. In education, that's called the principle of primacy. The first explanation you hear for something is easier to remember than any explanation you hear after that. My dad was a certified teacher by the time I learned to talk, so he knew about that. So when I was 3, before I heard any creation myths, he and my mom bought me a set of zoo animals. I remember when he dumped the bag out on the floor. They looked like a bunch of colorful pieces of plastic, but then he started setting them up, all facing the same way. And all those heads and eyes and legs and tails suddenly made it look like something was happening. Then he told me about how all the animals' different parts helped them live wherever they lived. The anteater and the armadillo both had long pointy snouts so they could eat bugs out of little holes. The alligator had short legs and a long tail so he could swim in the river. He had a big mouth full of pointy teeth too so he could eat the hippopotamus. Then they showed me how the gorilla was shaped like a person. The monkey was shaped kind of like a person too, but not as much. And that's where people came from. My best friend in elementary school was a Mormon. When my brother was about 3, my friend's mom asked him and my mom if they would like her to tell him the creation story. My mom said something like, "Well, that's very nice of you to offer, but no thanks." And my friend's mom said something like, "Well, he's probably starting to have some questions about life, and I don't want him to worry." And my mom said something like, "Well, he's not worried, so he doesn't need it." I'm pretty sure it was soon after that that he got his own set of zoo animals. Another part of the creation myths is the principle of effect. People remember best whichever explanations for things have the most powerful emotional effect on them. All of the Abrahamic religions originated in agricultural societies. To people who are in control of most of the things that affect them the most, a story about the world being created by an extremely powerful person is easy to believe. The myths of hunter-gatherers aren't that simple. Pantheism is a bunch of interacting things all happening at once. My parents thought of this too. So they raised my brother and me in and around forests, which was where they grew up, where most of the living things you can see for 20 miles in any direction aren't under the control of humans. When we lived in California near the redwoods, we lived in the house my grandfather built. It was an ongoing challenge to figure out how to make our trash cans easy for us to get into while keeping the black bears from getting into them. One of the bears got really bold and started prowling around people's houses a lot at night. One night my brother woke up and when he heard a noise and looked up at his bedroom window to see the bear looking in at him. He was 2 at the time, so he probably looked like a tasty little piece of meat. But our grandfather thought of that, which is why he put small windows in the children's rooms and put them high up in the walls. The bear had to stand on her hind legs just to get her face up to the window. So for a few minutes, my brother's bedroom turned into a private zoo. That's one of my brother's earliest memories. He remembers how exciting it was. He wasn't worried. Another principle of learning is the principle of readiness. It means students are receptive to learning things they're curious about. That means when your kid asks you why something is the way it is, that's the best time to tell them an answer that's scientific to the extent they can understand at that point, and that they can build upon as they get older and learn more. You also get the principle of primacy working for you if that's the first time they've heard an explanation for it. Or if there's something that you know your kid needs to start learning about now in order to get a lot of other things in life to make sense, you can draw their attention to it and get them to start wondering about it. If you pick a good time to bring it up, you can get the principle of effect working for you too. One day when I was about 4, my family and I were at the beach. Just as we walked onto the sand, my dad said, "Hey Ezra, come here, I want to show you something." And he bent down and picked up a pinch of sand between his fingers. He said, "Look at this sand. See how it's made up of all these teeny little pieces? If you look real close, you can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now look at this whole beach. This whole beach is covered in sand. How many pieces of sand do you think there are on this whole beach?" I think I looked at him kind of wide-eyed and said I didn't know. He said, "Well, that's all right. That's just something to think about." How many ideas in science depend on numbers that are so big they don't compare to any numbers that people deal with in everyday life? Off the top of my head, there's the 14 billion years since the universe began, the 4 billion years since life evolved, the 57 billion square miles of land surface of the Earth, the 7 billion people living on the land surface of the Earth. Anyone have any other good examples?
The number of grains of sand on the world.
Yeah, it's like numbers of
10 to the 23rd or something.
In chemistry, moles.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's like 10 to the 23rd, like 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd
Yeah,
or something.
exactly.
Is that it?
Yeah.
If you internalize the existence of huge numbers when you're young, it becomes a useful foundation for learning other ideas. If you start out thinking about the things you can see as the main level of reality, and don't start learning about huge numbers until you're in junior high, that makes the scientific discoveries that involve huge numbers seem like a bunch of individual exceptions to the main level of reality. Then things like evolution and climate change seem like they can't be very important because they seem like they're based on numbers that people basically made up. Small numbers are just big numbers in the opposite direction. Small numbers add up to something you can see eventually. My introduction to geology came from looking out our kitchen window. One day my dad pointed to the cliff face of the mountain across the river. This isn't it, but it looked kind of like this. He asked me if I could see the part in the middle where the rocks were a lighter color than the rest of the cliff. That was from a rock slide. He saw it happen. He was a little older than I was at the time, sitting here in the kitchen, looking out this window, when suddenly part of the mountain just fell off. It blocked the river and flooded the highway, and it took the Army Corps of Engineers a week to clear the debris. When we'd go down to the river now, a lot of the boulders we'd see, my dad could remember not being there. They used to be a couple 100 feet up the mountain. Erosion makes every mountain get a little shorter every time it gets rained on. Sooner or later, it adds up to something you can see. Some pagans have a term for this. They call it supernature. It means, essentially, nature making things happen that people didn't expect because it happens on such a huge scale. Music is another big part of religion. Songs about religious themes make the ideas more emotionally powerful. But if you take a step back, every song is a song about life in one way or another. And lots of songs contain lessons about life. There's a children's song from Scotland called An Ilkley Mór Badat. It means An Ilkley Mór without a hat. Since this is a folk song, it makes a lot more sense if you sing it around a campfire. Good thing we already got the lights down. Owen, where have you been since I saw thee? Owen, where have you been since I saw thee? Owen, where have you been since I saw thee? On Ilkley Mór without a hat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then thou shalt catch thy death of cold. Then thou shalt catch thy death of cold. Then thou shalt catch thy death of cold. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then we shall put thee in the ground. Then we shall put thee in the ground. Then we shall put thee in the ground. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then worms shall come and eat thee up. Then worms shall come and eat thee up. Then worms shall come and eat thee up. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then ducks shall come and eat up worms. Then ducks shall come and eat up worms. Then ducks shall come and eat up worms. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then we shall come and eat up ducks. Then we shall come and eat up ducks. Then we shall come and eat up ducks. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. Then we shall have our Owen back. Then we shall have our Owen back. Then we shall have our Owen back. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. On Ilkley Mór Badat. So, on one level, it's a funny little children's song about why you should wear your hat when you go out on the moors. On another level, it's a song about a food chain. And on another level, it's a song about the cycles of life. My brother and I were born in Maine, which is where my mom's side of the family is from. A few months after my brother was born, when I was 3, we moved to California. Before we left, my parents bought me a little jigsaw puzzle of the States. The pieces fit together in the tray, and every evening my dad drew on the inside of the tray where we had been that day. So when I was 3, I got a sense of just how big the United States is. Within a few weeks, I saw forests, mountain ranges, plains, deserts, the Mississippi River, cities, towns, and villages. And we made the trip in a truck towing a camper trailer, so we had a home that we brought with us. That was really interesting because our home stayed the same all the time, but the stuff outside our home changed every day. So in a way, I got to see some of American history too, because we were kind of like a wagon train moving west. And I got to see part of human history more generally because we made a lot of plans and preparations to move from where we lived to somewhere we wanted to live, even though I didn't know where we were going, like nomadic people, immigrants, and migrant workers have done throughout history. One of my parents' favorite songs around that time was Rocky Mountain High by John Denver. It's about a guy who moves to somewhere he wants to be so he can live the life he wants to live. My brother moved to Colorado when he was 19, and he's lived there ever since. He moved there for the snowboarding, but I kind of wonder if growing up hearing that song had anything to do with it. Every song is a song about something that someone feels is important. So if you approach life by looking for connections among things that you care about, rather than depending on someone to tell you what to care about, all your favorite songs as an adult are essentially a hymn book of your life. Something else religions use a lot of are proverbs. Religious fundamentalists love to quote scriptures to back up the things they say, but people everywhere think of good sayings that represent ideas. So if you ignore religious content, you can find a wide range of good ideas. Military sayings are a good reference source for ideas about biology and evolutionary psychology. People in the military have put a lot of thought into factors that contribute to life and death. I grew up in coastal forests, which is to say, parts of the country that were built on logging and ocean fishing, which are the two most dangerous jobs in the world. And it was a long way to the nearest colleges or universities from there. So in places I lived, the role models for getting the right answer weren't scientists, but military vets. A lot of people who don't lead dangerous lives think that some of these things are impolite to say. I just want to say that where I'm from, we consider it polite to talk in whatever way makes none of us get killed in 10 minutes from now. First, we have useless bullshit. That means anything that detracts from your ability to carry out your mission. Are you putting bullets down range? If you're not completing the final step in a process, all the efforts you're devoting to the steps that lead up to that final step don't mean anything. Choosing to fail. If you have the abilities, skills, resources, and opportunities you need to succeed at your goals, and you still aren't succeeding at them, it's your own fault. Check yourself. Think about what goal you're trying to reach. Think about what you're doing right now. Think about whether or not what you're doing right now will help you reach your goal. And think about why you believe it should. Work the problem. Don't let the problem work you. In aviation, we call that be the pilot, don't be a passenger. It means think about the situation you're in and take actions that solve immediate problems in ways that will add up to long-term success at your goals. No one has ever won a war without infantry. Ideas about how things should be don't succeed until people apply the ideas at the individual level. REMF. This stands for Rear Echelon Motherfucker. It means a person who can afford to make stupid mistakes because they aren't one of the people who pay the price for stupid mistakes, or who has the opportunity to take advantage of other people's sacrifices, or who doesn't understand how to do anything themselves because they don't have to do anything themselves. It's synonymous with ivory tower intellectual. Can you plow a line? This is a farming saying. Plowing a line means plowing a straight line in a field with a consistent width and depth. The question means, if you don't know about simple ideas, what do your complicated ideas really prove? If you try to skip over simple ideas and jump right into thinking about complicated ideas, what are you even thinking about? That's synonymous with ego, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. Military left and military right. Simple facts remain true in complicated situations. They developed this saying because combat is so unlike anything else in life that even though soldiers train for combat, going into real combat for the first time is such a shock that a lot of them can't even remember what the words left and right mean. Playing with your dick means Making yourself feel like you're succeeding at your goals isn't the same thing as doing what it takes to actually succeed at them. It's time to grow some hair on your balls. When an inconvenient situation needs to be dealt with, you don't have the right to maintain your convenient point of view. The fog of war. When you have to make decisions based on incomplete information, you inevitably make mistakes. As biologists have discovered, for every naturally occurring poison in the world, there's an antidote somewhere nearby because whatever species has been affected by the poison has evolved a resistance to it. I thought of this while I was reading Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything. Atheists write book after book after book after book about why atheism is better than religion. So I think it's really funny that none of these college-educated people seem to have noticed that the language of the people they're criticizing contains concepts that summarize all of their books in 2 sentences. When you believe things about the world that aren't true, you make fog of war mistakes. Religious fundamentalism is an attempt to make the fog permanent. The idea that religious people value unreliable information simply isn't true. All of my friends who have served in the Army or Marine Corps infantry have trained to disassemble, clean, and reassemble their M16s in the dark while lying face down in the mud with live bullets being shot 4 feet over their heads. We all value reliable information to the extent that we believe that reliable information is necessary and available. Those are some simple differences between having a religious childhood or not. When you combine differences, more interesting things happen. Multimedia storytelling is one. When I was in 1st grade, I found some books at the library that came with audio tapes of people reading the books. I thought that was a cool idea because I could read the book along with the person on the tape and look at the pictures. So that was a good way to practice reading. I didn't realize at the time, but whoever donated the books to the library had some other motive. All of the books were Bible stories. One of the books was called Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. It's a story about this heroic guy who finds a city full of evil people, so he leads his own people there to lay siege to the city of Jericho. But the walls of Jericho were supposed to be impossible to breach. Then their God tells Joshua how to do it. They had to march around the city once each day for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, they had to march around the city 7 times, and the priests would play a long final blast on their horns. And just like that, the walls of the city collapsed and the whole city was destroyed and everyone in it died or something like that. I thought that was really exciting, so I went and told my dad about it. He kind of laughed and said, "Yeah, I've heard that story. People have been telling it a long time. But it's just a story. There aren't really any cities where all the people are evil. People used to think that, but it's not true. Why couldn't he have just walked up to the city and talked to people there? He could have said, 'Hi, my name's Joshua. What's your name?' I didn't know it at the time, but the idea that there are cities that need to be completely destroyed and all the people in them killed had basically been the reasoning behind the bombing campaigns of London, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Hanoi. That same year, my mom heard about Dungeons and Dragons. So we got my dad the basic rule set for his birthday. Now, since role-playing games have such a stigma attached to them as escapist fantasies for nerds, and since we love definitions of words so much here in the SFTS, a nerd is a person who has a high level of emotional commitment to ideas most people don't see any point to.
That's pretty accurate, I guess. Yeah.
All right, glad you approve.
Very nerdy definition of nerd.
Long before there were computers and role-playing games, there were baseball cards. Very, very few people care how many strikes a pitcher threw in a baseball season that happened 35 years ago. So yes, role-playing games can be escapist fantasies just like any passive entertainment can be, including sports. But they can be a lot more than that too. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings stories to help recreate a pre-Christian cultural identity for the British Isles. Most of my ancestors were from the British Isles, and none of them were from the Middle East, so I've never understood why people expect me to ignore my own cultural history and adopt someone else's. The Lord of the Rings stories were also one of the main inspirations for Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons has been an inspiration for every role-playing game since. As a friend of mine told me, for him, role-playing games were a big step away from his Christian fundamentalist childhood and toward agnosticism, just by imagining living in a world where people found other organizing concepts besides monotheistic religions. In my family, role-playing games brought together a lot of things we've been doing and took them another step. First, we lived out in the mountains where there had never been any TV reception. Instead of a TV, we had a house full of books. So my brother and me would go play out in the woods by day, and our parents would read us bedtime stories at night, just like our grandmother used to read to my dad and his brothers and sisters, which is where a lot of the books came from. Now with role-playing games, we were imagining things and turning it into a story at the same time. For me and a lot of other people I've known, role-playing games have been a stepping stone to writing, acting, graphic art, film, history, costuming, metalworking, leatherworking, basically everything else you see at a Renaissance festival, sculpture, architecture, this list could go on and on. The point is, imagining an entire world gives you a lot of room to imagine doing things that you can't see any direct path to in real life from wherever you are now. In my family, we started out with my dad running the adventures and me and my brother and my mom playing them. When we started, I was 6 and my brother was 3. That let us practice making adult decisions in adult situations with no consequences, except for our seeing how well our decisions worked out. That was things like planning ahead and adapting to changing situations so we could escape traps, outsmart animals, and develop tactics to defeat intelligent monsters. Early on, we ran into a black bear, and our mom came up with the idea that instead of trying to kill her, we ought to light our torches so we could scare her off with fire. So things like that led into things like physics, biology, psychology, and systems thinking. And for me, that led to getting a lot of practice with the idea of being part of a world that could have gods in it, but that was ruled ultimately by an interconnected set of mathematical laws. For all of that, the Dungeons & Dragons books were written around fairly simplistic ideas about good and evil. The rules reward you for killing monsters and finding treasure. In the Lord of the Rings stories, the monsters invade the lands of the humans and other nice people, so there are no moral complications to some heroes slaying the monsters and bringing home some gold. But when you start invading monsters' territory, all that moral simplicity falls apart. Now you aren't fighting the monsters in self-defense. Now you're fighting monsters that would be a threat to the humans if the humans live nearby, not because the humans live nearby already, but because the humans want to move into the area. So now you fight the monsters and take their treasure because you still feel the monsters are evil, but really all you are now is one part of an ecosystem. And you know all those orcs and goblins and things in the Lord of the Rings movies? They're really disgusting, and they talk about eating people all the time, and some of them were created by magic in big vats of slime specifically to kill humans. But fundamentally, they are conscious creatures. If you intentionally and without provocation cause suffering to conscious creatures just so you can take their treasure and then justify it by saying they're evil, you're not doing anything heroic. You're just reinventing the whole history of imperialism. My brother and I started out playing the game believing in mythical good and evil. But our dad played the game as if all the creatures in it were trying to succeed at goals. Eventually, the mythical good and evil approach to dealing with creatures brought us to the point of invading the lairs of intelligent monsters. Sooner or later, we'd make the survivors surrender, and the most reasonable things for the monsters to say to us were the same things indigenous people had said to Europeans centuries before, and the kinds of things North Vietnamese people had said to Americans more recently. Who are you people? What are you doing in our cave? You already have all of our gold, and we're the last 4 warriors. You've killed all the rest. All we have left are women and children. We're not a threat to you. Why don't you just leave us alone? I can imagine a lot of people thinking it's abusive of parents to shatter their children's fantasies and make them think about things like that in a game when they're 9 or 10. Then again, I think that's better than letting your kids grow up believing in myths about good and evil and waiting for them to hear that kind of stuff in real life when they're 19 or 20 in the middle of a burning village on the other side of the world with a bunch of real dead people lying around them. Not believing in supernatural things goes way beyond religion. Every mistake you make is a decision that you made based on faulty information that you thought was accurate information. If you think you can eat unhealthy food all the time and never exercise and not get fat, you're essentially depending on supernatural intervention to make your plan work. Racism is a pretty complicated problem in the US because it has a convoluted history, and there are some parts of it a lot of people still don't want to talk about. As I'm sure you all know, race has no biological foundation. Biologically, what we call races are just ethnicities. They're groups of people who have shared cultures and histories because of their shared geographical origins. Race started out as a political status. The plan was to create a caste system by assigning rights according to continent of origin. White didn't really mean European descent. It meant people who lawmakers trusted to have the highest political status. Over the course of the 19th century, some serious debates about immigrants happened in the US that sound really weird now. Are Irish people white? Are Italians white? Are Jews white? As we all know, it took 44 presidencies to elect a black president. But that only scratches the surface on the connection between ethnicity and trust with political power. President Obama is mostly English on his mother's side, that is to say, British. In our entire history, we've only had 3 presidents who had no British ancestry. My family was a white, black, Native American family before I was born. One big reason secularism has been so important to us is for the same reason we have a secular government in the US. Using evidence is the only way of searching for the truth that's fair to people of diverse points of view. So we've been discussing for a long time a lot of things people are just starting to tiptoe around now. One that I see a lot of is division of labor. Division of labor was a result of the development of agriculture. Once people started farming, they started producing food surpluses. So they started being able to support some people who didn't need to produce their own food, so those people could spend their time using other talents and developing other skills. It was a big event in human history because it led to a lot of new inventions and social developments. Today, an easy way to show off how much political status you have is to show off how much division of labor you can depend on. Deciding that you're going to do things you like and not do things you don't like depends on decision-making power. And decision-making power means political power. In other words, it's a way to show off how white you are. Further back, the idea behind slavery was that white people would get to do what they wanted in life and would get to delegate the things they didn't want to do to other people. So it's funny to me today to see how many people have gotten so caught up in equating doing what you want with succeeding in life that they didn't notice that important things that nobody felt like doing weren't getting done. We have the Origin Symposiums here now, and other people are doing similar things in other places. Lawrence Krauss has been helping to pioneer a lot of new intellectual territory by bringing together experts in a lot of different fields. But my question is, why has it taken this long? Why don't we already have experts in the connections among fields? Why did everyone get so specialized in the fields they wanted to specialize in that it has to be such a big, exciting, courageous, controversial thing to bring them all together now? What kind of a plan was that? This is really just multimedia storytelling on a much broader scale. My parents raised my brother and me with the attitude that people can do everything people have done, so we should try to do as much of it as we can, and especially some of the vital stuff. So in addition to my growing up in a house full of books, both my parents liked to cook, sew, and learn old crafts like making candles and preserving food. My dad was constantly renovating the house, and he did most of our automotive repairs and played musical instruments. My mom did a lot of gardening and grew some of the food we ate. And then there was camping, hiking, backpacking, boating. To cut a long story short, lots of activities that developed skills and produced tangible results. That meant my brother and me learning some of those skills and living among the results they produced and the tools that produced them. Doing things that you learn from and that produce tangible results make you see a lot of different parts of the story of life fitting together instead of you're alternating between a job and passive entertainment and leaving the meaning of life stuff up to someone else. So then when you see Dr. Krauss and Sam Harris on a stage together looking for a connection between physics and morality, that's just one more puzzle that needs to be solved. Now we can look for some unifying principles. Religion, at its best, is a way of brainstorming answers to questions people don't yet have enough information about to answer with evidence. But most people don't realize how anthropocentric our interpretations of the world are. So a lot of that brainstorming centers around looking for ways human-like intelligence could cause those things, and a lot of people can't accept the possibility that things could happen with no human-like decision-making at all. A lot of people today pride themselves on not believing that the sun is driven across the sky by a god. But they're still convinced that the law of gravity that makes the earth revolve around the sun had to have been created by a god. When they say their omnipotent human-like God must have created gravity because he is eternal, and you ask them why the law of gravity couldn't be eternal, because the attraction of two things to each other is a lot simpler than a super powerful human-like mind, they won't even understand what you're talking about. If you try to understand the universe by looking for patterns of human decision-making and patterns of events, you end up trying to understand the universe by trying to understand your God's personality. Atheist spirituality works in the opposite direction, which is why it's so incomprehensible to a lot of religious people. Scientific laws are discoveries of mathematical relationships among things in the universe. They're laws because they're constant relationships. So how do the interactions among those constant relationships in different combinations create the variability in people's personalities, ideas, feelings, and decision-making? Every story people tell about life has at the very least a source of creation of life, a source of destruction, and limits on what people can do. That means every story about life contains an interpretation of evolution, the second law of thermodynamics, and the first law of thermodynamics. That means every story about life is a variation on three basic themes. And each of those variations made sense to some group of people in the living conditions they had with the bodies of ideas they had. The first law of thermodynamics is that matter and energy can never be created or destroyed, they only change form. That means the energy content of the universe is constant. That's hard to notice on Earth because we keep getting energy from the sun. Sunlight plus the chemistry of Earth stores up energy in chemical bonds. That's where fossil fuels come from. But everything that happens in the universe as a whole happens in the context of some finite number. Belief in an omnipotent being is a belief in a being for whom the first law of thermodynamics doesn't apply. The second law of thermodynamics is that matter and energy move from order to disorder more than they move from disorder to order. So in the universe as a whole, disorder increases over time. The reason the universe is expanding is because energy is flowing outward from the Big Bang. The flow of all the energy in the universe is part of that. Evolution is the result of replication, variation, and selection. Each of those is a way that things spread out. That means evolution is the result of three aspects of the second law of thermodynamics running into each other. Replication is the result of genes spreading from parents to offspring. Variation is the result of genes spreading into different combinations in the process of spreading from parents to offspring. Selection is also known as destruction. Organisms that aren't good matches for their environments usually die without reproducing. Those organisms' physical makeup spread outward from their bodies before their genes spread into offspring. Evolution is the foundation of psychology. So that means that anything anyone has ever thought or felt is the product of three interacting components of one mathematical law. So with this as the universal foundation of all the profound feelings anyone has ever felt, now we can look at patterns of ideas, feelings, and behavior among groups of people, and look at how the history of that group of people would make so many of them think of the same ideas or feel the same emotions. Every life philosophy has some specific ideas about the creation of life, destruction, and limits to what people can do. But to really understand how a life philosophy functions, you have to look for the attitudes that hold the ideas together. As I've said, white people have had the highest political status in the US for most of our history. And a lot of white people talk about the importance of strength. That can mean a lot of different things, but what all those definitions have in common is that they're ways of getting what you want. Being able to get what you want seems like an obvious thing for people to want. That idea is always really popular with any group of people whenever they get the chance to get more of what they want. But that isn't a very helpful attitude for trying to understand science. That attitude works great with technology because the whole reason people invent things is to get more of what they want. But what happens whenever someone makes a scientific discovery that proves we aren't going to get what we want? A lot of people immediately start arguing that the discovery must be wrong. Buddhism and other Asian spiritual traditions are big inspirations to scientists. Tao in Taoism means the way. Basically, the big difference between European and Asian history is that most Asians don't live within a few hundred miles of a coastline, And when the population of Asia reached the limits of what the available farmland and other resources could support, they didn't discover 3 more continents full of resources they could move to. So Asians have gotten a lot more practice than white people at adapting to the situations they're in, rather than going somewhere else to get what they want. The idea of Tao is that you have to be patient in life, and a lot of the time you have to go along with what's happening around you and wait for opportunities to get things you want. You can hear these differences in attitudes in the things people from the 2 groups talk about in their patterns of vocal inflection. White people are really good at getting excited about the idea of getting what they want, and Asians usually sound a lot more patient. For a lot of the history of the US, being black has meant that white people have the right to take just about everything you have. So black spirituality here is built up around things nobody can take from you. And that's why, as the saying goes, black people have so much soul. Soul, as things nobody can take from you, translates into science terms as genes, feelings, and life experience. It means that your sense of identity is separate from your possessions. It also means that things other than people have fundamental structures. So you might notice that while white people are so good at talking about how much they're going to change things and get what they want, black people's starting point for talking about reality often has more clearly defined sense of right and wrong that's based on respect for their ideas of fundamental structures of things. As one saying goes about the struggle for equality as minorities in a democracy, when you got God on your side, you're always in the majority. In science terms, when you find a way to make the causal structure of the universe work to your advantage more than it works to your opponent's advantage, eventually you win. That attitude that you're right because you're here, not because you're winning, is another good starting point for believing that the truth isn't always convenient for people. To see how spirituality develops when a group of people's history gets worse by another order of magnitude, we can look at Native Americans. Slavery and everything that came with it was bad, but nobody in North America ever had a plan to make black people cease to exist altogether. Today, the black population of the US is about 10 times the size of the Native American population. So where do you find a starting point for thinking optimistically about life when the people with the highest political status can take everything you have, including your life? Native Americans talk about spirit a lot. Spirit means your existence as part of the larger world. There's a lot of overlap between spirit and soul. While soul focuses on the idea that you're right because you are here, spirit focuses on the idea that you're right because you were here. From strength to Tao to soul to spirit, the idea of truth moves in steps from ability to affect the world to being part of the cycles of life. Also, in 1491, all Native Americans lived in the Stone Age, even though they had figured out how to make small things out of copper and gold. So they hadn't separated themselves from the natural world as much as Europeans had. In North America in 1491, human physiology interacted with the world much more directly than it did in Europe. That meant there was much less need to make up stories to try to explain why people act the way they do, because the benefits to people for acting the way they did were much more easy to see. And that's a big part of the reason that Native Americans who follow their spiritual traditions today have a lot of trouble getting them recognized as the equivalents of religions, because their fantastical stuff just isn't as extravagant enough to look like a religion to many Christians. It's the truth to effort ratio again. Spirit, as a person's interactions with their surroundings, fits right into environmental science. The belief that we're supposed to get what we want makes people not see any need to think about the possibility of environmental disaster. That leads to the belief that regardless of what the evidence says or how much evidence has been discovered, there must be more to it that we haven't discovered yet that's going to make everything turn out well for us. Seeing people as parts of the cycles of life means that whatever happens to us is going to happen because of whatever happens to the rest of the world. I've been watching videos on YouTube lately of Florence Krauss and Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about physics, and it's just what I predicted. Dr. Krauss says a lot of things like, well, we have these pictures of the Big Bang that have radiated back to our telescopes from the edges of the universe, but there's very little we can be certain of in science because there's just so much about the universe that we don't understand. Dr. Tyson says a lot of things like, there are 8 planets in our solar system, get over it. They have 2 different attitudes for looking at the same information, and both of them are helpful. Dr. Krauss is really good at the division of labor part, where he focuses on the facts that are relevant to what he's looking for and separates them from the facts that aren't relevant. If you have a problem with facts that aren't relevant, that's not his problem. You can go argue with someone from some other department. Dr. Tyson seems better prepared for the fact that when you're pioneering something, some parts of the information you find don't fit neatly into people's pre-existing divisions of labor. So whoever does understand the information is going to have to recognize when the body of information is complete enough to act upon it and take the next step. If you have a problem with the facts, you just need to get over it because there's no point in arguing about it. And more importantly, regardless of the attitudes either of those guys actually uses to interpret the evidence, those two useful attitudes are what they communicate to the people who see them. Now I can bring all this together with one unifying theme and one visualization exercise that works for everything. I call this the thermodynamic pyramid. This is Mount Improbable in biology, the cone of uncertainty in physics, and Sam Harris's moral landscape all rolled into one. Everything is made up of simpler things. So to understand what something is, you need to understand how its components fit together. To understand what a table does, you have to understand what each of its parts does, and how each of them doing what they do turns into the overall function of and the idea of the table. So the table is the pinnacle of the pyramid, and its component parts make up the body of the pyramid. And then you can take that further. What are each of the parts made of? And how are they made? How is the plastic made? Where did the chemicals come from? If you want, you can break this all the way down to atomic physics and the origin of the universe. The idea that things are made of components seems so obvious, this doesn't seem like a discovery. But it's easy to lose sight of that because every traditional belief is based on less evidence than we have now. So if you're using a traditional idea of something without looking at how that thing is created by its components, whatever you're thinking about isn't science. It's the kind of ideas that scientific discoveries disprove. You can use the thermodynamic pyramid for more abstract things. This moment in time is the result of everything before it. This moment of your life is made up of everything that led up to it. Any moment in the past or future was or will be made up of everything that led up to it. The current state of a species is made up of all the evolutionary steps that led to it. That's Mount Improbable. More abstract still, if you start with the present at the peak of the pyramid and look back on history, the further you look back, the more components you can see, but the more loosely connected they'll be. There's no guarantee that you will be able to see the past clearly enough to predict the present from it. That's the cone of uncertainty. Likewise, when you look to the future and try to predict the outcome of an interaction of factors in the present, the further into the future you look, the wider the possibilities spread out. This isn't quite how Dr. Harris described his moral landscape, but we all have ideals we're trying to reach. To reach our ideals, we have to bring together a bunch of components. If we've only brought together some of the components we need, then we can only get partway to where we're trying to go. For human behavior in general, the decision anyone is making in the present is always an attempt to maximize the survival rates of their genes. So the person has a pyramid of the present, which they're trying to build up to successive pyramids of the future, and that's the theme that connects all the pyramids to each other. The body of each of those pyramids is made up of the sources of the person's perceptions that the decisions they make maximize the survival rates of their genes. One way or another, with everything a person does, they're trying to make something better for themselves. So to understand what the person is doing, look at how the factors in their situations created their perceptions of the best course of action. And of course, this works for figuring out your own feelings too. Every feeling is a motivation to do something. So to figure out what you're feeling, figure out how factors in your situation have affected your perception of the present and future. To break complicated feelings down to components, ask yourself, what do I feel is happening in this situation, and what do I feel I should do about it? That's what you're always trying to figure out subconsciously, so asking yourself that consciously usually makes things make a lot more sense. Moving up in the thermodynamic pyramid means increasing certainty or order by making things more like the way you want them to be. Moving down the thermodynamic pyramid means decreasing certainty or order by making things less organized toward a predictable outcome that you want. This was one of my first philosophical discoveries. People work all week doing predictable things that other people want so that they can get paid money to spend on more of what they want for themselves. And then what do they do on Friday nights? People like to go out and have fun. And everything that's exciting involves some form of decrease of certainty. Gambling makes the risk explicit. Playing sports is a physical risk. Watching sports is an emotional risk because your favorite team might lose. Movies work the same way. For that matter, we're on a college campus, so there are probably at least 100 bars within 5 miles of here. Why is a bunch of people getting together in a room such an endless source of excitement for so many people? When you put a lot of people together, there's a lot that can happen. If you join in, there are many possible outcomes, only one of which will actually happen. If you add alcohol, you increase the possibilities and reduce the certainty. If you add music and dance floors and other forms of emotional stimulation, you increase the possibilities and decrease the certainty further. On one level, anyway. On the level of specific things happening to specific people. On the level of general patterns, every Saturday night around a college campus is exactly the same as every other Saturday night. A bunch of people get drunk and flirt with each other, and some of them hook up with people they want to hook up with, and some don't hook up with people they want to hook up with. If your idea of a good time is to spend Friday or Saturday nights at home reading books about philosophy or biochemistry, you're still doing the same thing. You're adding ideas to your mind, feeling like it's going to change your perspective of the world, without knowing in advance exactly how it's going to change your perspective, but wanting to find out. Even people who are excited about going to church on Sunday are searching for a change in relationships among certainty and uncertainty. They're uncertain about some things, so they join a group of other people who are uncertain about the same things, so they can build a community structure for dealing with uncertainty. We're doing the same thing right now. The whole point of this discussion is to jump down the thermodynamic pyramid to show you how ideas you already know about can fit together in ways you didn't think of and put you on a better path to finding what you're looking for. So here people are, working all week, getting paid to increase certainty, then turning around on Friday nights and spending their money to decrease certainty to make their lives more interesting. The trick to it is that they make their money to increase certainty in their lives and then pay for uncertainty in a context they're prepared for. Nobody goes out on Friday night looking for complete uncertainty. People look for the types of uncertainty they want to be involved in. But outside any of those contexts is a bigger context where the risks are bigger to the people involved. People make movies about war and crime and natural disasters, and other people pay to watch them on Friday nights because of the body of ideas we've built up from those things really happening to people. Every new idea is pioneered by people who take the risk and pay the price to do something for the first time without the benefit of being able to imitate someone else's previous success. This brings us to one final lesson from storytelling and other art forms. It's called hyperrealism. It means the use of highly concentrated sensory input to create a powerful emotional effect in an audience. Everyone does this all the time. This is how you tell someone what you did last week in 2 minutes. A movie only shows you a couple of hours in the lives of some protagonists, but it makes you feel like it shows you a lot more than that because of the way the artists concentrate sensory input into the movie. A high-budget movie today takes over 10,000 people to make and hundreds of thousands of working hours just to create 2 or 3 hours of sensory input that you watch. That's a gigantic thermodynamic pyramid. A lot of people say that movies lead people to have unrealistic expectations of themselves and other people. Movie stars have entire departments devoted to making them look attractive and other departments devoted to making the things they do look exciting. It's almost impossible for anyone in real life to look as good as a movie star. But that's only one way to look at it. Movie stars are attractive to their audiences because they look like their audience's perception of health. And they look so healthy that 2 hours of watching them makes you feel like you've seen a lifetime of health. Likewise, the plots of movies are highly condensed patterns of decision-making that we like. On one level, action movies are about people using and surviving physically impossible levels of violence. On another level, action movies are about people facing serious threats to their well-being and taking decisive action to solve the problems. Anyone who has ever succeeded at anything difficult in life has done it by taking decisive action. I can tell you the plot to every movie that will ever be made right now. A character, or a group of characters, who an audience can relate to in some way, will face serious challenges to their goals and will take big risks to overcome those challenges. Every interesting story ever told is a story about organisms adapting to their environments. In movie theaters all over the world, people pay to watch variations on the story of life over and over and over and over. To be constructively inspired by movies, all you have to do is to ask yourself what it was that you liked about the movie and how similar themes play out in your life. On the broadest level, every movie you like is a metaphor for you doing whatever it is that you like to do, because it's a story about people doing whatever it takes to succeed. So this brings us right back to the difference between religious and evidence-based spirituality that I started this discussion with. Religions make bigger promises and try to reach them with smaller bodies of ideas. Atheist spirituality doesn't look like spirituality at all to a lot of religious people because it isn't a leap of faith. Evidence-based spirituality values small, reliable steps toward the truth over big guesses. It builds up from a broader foundation of sources and from the insights of more people. In closing, evidence-based spirituality is much more robust than religious spirituality because the evidence is all around you, if you know how to recognize it.
Very good.
Thank you.